Karen called 911 the second I finished building a small shed by my lake cabin. Claimed it was an unapproved structure and a code violation. Cops showed up, checked the permits, all legal. But while they were there, my K9 started barking near her property line. Dug up something wrapped in plastic behind her fence. Let's just say, after that, she stopped talking about code violations real quick. The cabin had always been a place of silence, still water, and self-repair. My grandfather built it when he came back from the war, back when land was still cheap and a man could swing a hammer without a permit or a policy number. Tucked between two hills and shaded by tall pine, the lakeside cabin sat like a secret, passed down generation to generation, never changing much except for who was holding the keys. I didn't grow up there full time, but it was always the place we returned to when the world outside got too loud. I learned to fish on that lake, learned to split wood, learned how to stay still long enough for the deer to walk right past you without knowing. So when I inherited the place after my father passed, there wasn't a second of hesitation. I packed up, drove the 200 miles, and took root. No big move announcement. No social media brag. Just home. Life at the cabin was peaceful. Mornings with black coffee and mist crawling off the lake. Afternoons fixing the dock or mending the back fence. Evenings spent reading or walking the trails. And of course, I wasn't alone. About 6 months before all this happened, I adopted Rex, a retired K9 who had spent the better part of a decade doing search and rescue with a fire department in the next county over. He was aging but sharp, the kind of dog that didn't bark at squirrels or chew on your boots. No, Rex listened, observed. You could tell he had seen things that most people hadn't, and that he'd never forgotten them. He took to the cabin life instantly. Slept near the fireplace. Stuck close to the property lines. Loved the lake, but never splashed around like a puppy. Rex was always working, even when he was off duty. As I settled into my new rhythm, I realized the one thing missing was decent storage. The tools I used every day, axes, shovels, rakes, fuel cans, were piled haphazardly in a covered lean-to behind the house. It was fine in summer, but I knew what snow could do to exposed gear. So I decided to build a proper shed. Nothing fancy, just a 10 by 12 structure with a tin roof, pressure-treated wood, and a locking door. Something that could stand for a few decades, maybe more. I drew up the plans myself. I even checked the local ordinances and called the county to confirm. I didn't need a permit because I was outside city limits and the structure was under 120 square feet. All legal, all squared away. But of course, that's where she came in. Karen. She lived across the tree line, in one of those new houses built by the HOA that had crept in over the last 10 years. I'd never interacted with her directly, but I'd heard stories. The kind of woman who carried a clipboard on walks, who took pictures of your weeds, who once tried to fine her own neighbor for hanging a flag too low on the pole. If you've lived anywhere near an HOA, you know the type. For years, the HOA had left the cabin alone, mainly because the property line wasn't clear and no one wanted to challenge an owner with 30-year-old deed rights. They focused on their own development, making sure garage doors matched and lawn gnomes were approved in writing. But Karen? She must have gotten bored. Or maybe I just made a convenient new target. I never received a welcome note. No knock at the door. Just a woman standing on the gravel road one morning, arms folded, staring like I had just pitched a circus tent instead of framing a simple shed. He nodded a hair. She didn't nod back. I should have known then. Over the next few days, I noticed her walking more frequently. She'd stand and take photos with her phone, sometimes with flash, even though it was daylight. One afternoon, I caught her measuring something with a tape measure from the edge of her yard. Rex sat next to me the whole time, just watching. Don't worry, buddy, I told him. Some people don't like it when you build anything they didn't approve. He blinked, then looked back at her like he already knew something I didn't. I didn't stop the build. Why should I? I wasn't breaking any laws, wasn't stepping over any lines. The shed sat fully on my property, 30 feet from the lake, and well within all setback rules. Besides, I wasn't doing anything commercial or loud, just building a place to store my things, like a man should be able to do on his land. Rex seemed to enjoy the process too. He'd sit nearby, ears perked, eyes scanning. When I dropped nails, he'd nudge them back toward me. When I moved lumber, he'd trot ahead like a supervisor on patrol. By the time the frame was up and the roof installed, I was already planning to stain the siding and hang a small light above the door. The shed was shaping up perfectly, but so was Karen's grudge. And neither of us knew, not yet, what Rex was going to find. Because as much as she thought my shed was the problem, the real story was sitting buried just a yard from her perfectly trimmed lawn. It didn't take long for Karen to move from passive glares to full-blown letters. The first one showed up on my door just 2 days after the roof was sealed on the shed. Tucked neatly inside a plastic sleeve, printed in 12-point Times New Roman, it read like a notice from an emperor, except the emblem at the top was from the HOA, not a government body. Dear resident, we have received visual reports of structure being built on what appears to be HOA-adjacent land. Please be advised that any construction visible from the shared lakefront must adhere to HOA-approved aesthetic guidelines per Article 6, Section 3B. Unapproved construction may result in a fine and corrective citation. I had to laugh. HOA-adjacent, that was a new one. I didn't respond, because I didn't know them anything. The shed was built legally on my land, under the exemption threshold, and well within all zoning rules. And the HOA? They had no jurisdiction here. Never had. But Karen didn't take silence as a ceasefire. She took it as a challenge. The next morning, I found a second letter in my mailbox, this one with a red sticker across the top. Second notice, compliance review pending. Pending what? A neighborhood tantrum? I decided to respond. Not with words, but with a simple move. I hung a laminated copy of my property deed and parcel map right on the front of the shed. It clearly outlined the boundary lines, highlighted my land ownership, and underscored that the HOA's border stopped 40 feet short of my tool shed. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Later that week, I caught Karen on the side of the road, pacing near the edge of my gravel drive, phone in hand. She was snapping photos again. This time, she waved me down. "Excuse me," she called out, marching toward me like she had a badge. Rex stirred beside me. His ears rose. "Yes," I said calmly. "This shed," she snapped, gesturing toward it with exaggerated contempt, "is out of place. It doesn't match community guidelines. You can't just throw up buildings without getting approval. Ma'am, you don't have authority here." "We'll see about that," she said, and walked off, heels clacking against dirt like she expected applause. 2 days later, the police showed up. I was inside staining the trim when I heard tires on gravel and a door shut with that crisp authority only government vehicles make. When I stepped out, 2 officers were already approaching the shed. One had a notepad. The other was eyeing my hammer like it was evidence. Rex stood silently by my side. "Afternoon," I said. "Can I help you?" "Hi, sir," the officer said. "We got a call about unauthorized construction, possibly on protected land. Do you have ID and any proof of ownership?" "Of course," I said without hesitation. I handed them my license, then went inside and returned with the parcel map, deed, and the permit exemption form I'd printed from the county's website. It took a moment to read. Karen, of course, had followed them. She stood near the road, arms crossed, sunglasses perched just high enough to pretend she wasn't eavesdropping, but she watched every second. The second officer looked back at her, then to me. "Yeah, this checks out. Looks like everything's above board. You're well within the law, sir." I nodded. "Always am." The first officer scribbled something in his book. "Sorry to bother you. We have to check when there's a call." "No worries," I said, holding back a grin. Glad to see the system works. They left without incident. Karen stood there a moment longer, clearly irritated that things hadn't gone her way. But she turned sharply and stormed back to her side of the line, barking something into her phone. Probably the HOA group chat, if I had to guess. But that should have been the end. It wasn't. Rex, who had stayed quiet through the entire ordeal, suddenly started sniffing near the fence line. Not casually, like a curious pup. This was different. This was working dog mode. Head low, tail stiff, ears forward. He made a tight arc, walking along the brush just behind the shed, until he stopped at a spot near the edge of my fence where the pine needles had been disturbed. I watched as he circled, then sat. He only did that when he picked up something unusual. "What is it, bud?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't bark. He didn't dig. He just looked at me and flicked his nose once toward the ground. I crouched. The dirt had clearly been moved recently. Loose pine straw laid in a thin layer over disturbed earth. No markings, no tools, just a strange oval-shaped spot about 4 feet wide, tucked just behind a small privacy screen of trees. It wasn't on my side of the property. It was just beyond the split rail, on Karen's land. But Rex had never once been wrong. I didn't say anything to Karen that day. I didn't call the police. I didn't even mention what Rex found. Not yet. But I did set up one of my trail cameras and angled it through the brush, just over the fence line. Motion activated. Silent. High resolution. If there was something there, and Karen had something to hide, I wasn't going to let this turn into a game of he said, she said, not when a retired canine had just pointed a paw at her secrets. The shed? It was never the issue. The real story was still underground. The trail cam footage didn't lie. 2 days after Rex sniffed out that suspicious patch of dirt beyond the fence line, the camera caught motion just after midnight. At first, it was subtle, a flashlight beam wobbling through the branches. Then, a figure emerged, wearing gloves and dragging what looked like a large storage bin behind her. Karen, even at low resolution, her walk was unmistakable. Stiff shoulders, fast steps, that same windbreaker she wore when barking at neighbors over trash bins being 1 inch out of line. She struggled to move the bin, eventually wedging it between 2 trees behind the privacy screen. Then she started digging. The footage didn't catch everything, but the next few frames were clear. Karen pulling a folded tarp out of the bin, placing it in the hole, and hurriedly covering it with dirt. She kept looking over her shoulder like a character in a bad soap opera. But she never once glanced up at the trees, never saw the small lens watching from above. When the motion-triggered camera uploaded the clip to my phone the next morning, I sat there, stunned. The woman who had called the police on me over a legal shed had just buried something on her own property at night, in secret. I didn't jump to conclusions. I'm not that kind of guy. But I do believe in patterns, and this one stunk of something deeper than HOA overreach. I called the sheriff's department and explained everything. Sent over the footage. Mentioned that Rex, a retired canine with narcotics and search training, had flagged the area days earlier. They took it seriously. Within 24 hours, 2 unmarked units rolled up alongside Karen's curb. I watched from my porch as 3 plainclothes officers stepped out, walked up to her porch, and knocked. Karen opened the door with that same expression she wore when lecturing folks on lawn edging. Superiority dipped in fake civility. The moment the badge was shown, her posture shifted. Arms crossed, head tilted, denial already brewing. They spoke with her for 10 minutes before moving down toward the back of her property. I stayed behind my fence, but from my vantage point, I could see them pointing toward the tree line. Karen followed, hesitant. One officer broke away and walked to the same spot Rex had flagged. He motioned for the others. After a brief radio exchange, they rolled out yellow tape and asked Karen to stand back. One officer approached my gate. "Sir," he said, "mind if we step onto your side to view the area from this angle?" "Not all," I said. "Cameras mounted just there," I added, pointing to the tree above us. They watched the footage again on my tablet. This time zoomed in. You could clearly see Karen, her gloves, and the container. The lead officer gave a quiet whistle. "Yeah, this warrants a warrant." They left and came back 2 hours later, this time with a full search team and a court order. Karen stood on her porch, pacing. She tried calling someone, maybe her lawyer, maybe the HOA vice president who once stormed out of a book club over the wrong cheese plate. Didn't matter. When the officers returned, they didn't waste time. With measured precision, they moved toward the buried spot. 2 started digging. Karen kept yelling that this was a misunderstanding, that she was burying old garden mulch, that it was a gardening project. But her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Then came the discovery. A black plastic container. Locked. They pried it open gently. Inside were multiple sealed envelopes, a laptop, and several flash drives, all packed together in a weatherproof liner. One envelope was labeled HOA reimbursements, off book. Another simply said do not share, internal. But the real kicker? Beneath the folders was a rolled-up HOA banner, the one Karen used to hang at neighborhood meetings, wrapped around what looked like HOA property, a digital walkie system that had gone missing months earlier, and a thumb drive with labeled folders referencing finances and project budgets. The officers bagged everything. Karen broke. She launched into a tirade about how she was trying to protect records from corruption, how she didn't trust the treasurer, and how some things were better off-site. The sheriff's deputy calmly asked her to stop talking, then placed her in handcuffs. That's when the neighborhood really woke up. People gathered slowly. Phones started recording. Nobody said a word when Karen was escorted into the back of the cruiser. Just quiet stares and one slow clap from someone near the HOA bulletin board. The next few days were a whirlwind. Turns out Karen had been skimming funds through falsified landscaping invoices and event planning reimbursements that had no receipts to back them. A forensic accountant the HOA reluctantly hired confirmed that over $20,000 had quietly disappeared over the past 2 fiscal years. And Karen? She was using her position to manipulate policy, cover her tracks, and target residents she saw as threats to her little empire. The shed was never about appearances. It was a distraction, a preemptive strike to shift attention away from what she knew was coming. Questions, audits, and exposure. She didn't expect a shed to trigger it all. She certainly didn't expect a German shepherd with a nose for secrets. And when the police report was made public, neighbors finally saw the whole picture. The fines, the threats, the fabricated compliance warnings sent only to people who'd opposed her budget votes. She wasn't just a bad neighbor. She was a fraud, wrapped in vinyl siding and baked into HOA protocol. I didn't gloat. Didn't say a word when the board asked if I'd be willing to attend the emergency HOA meeting and verify my account. I simply nodded, handed over a USB with the footage, and thanked Rex with a steak that night for services rendered. The shed? Finished. The yard? Quiet. Karen? Removed. And the community? Finally saw what happens when the wrong person tries to play boss on land they don't control, especially when the real authority comes with paperwork, patience, and a very loyal dog. They always say the quietest moments come right after the loudest ones. That afternoon, once the patrol car turned the corner and disappeared down the Oak Line Street, the rest of us just stood there. No one quite knew what to say. Karen, the iron-willed HOA president, who once fined a neighbor for wind chimes, was now a suspect in a criminal investigation. And the shed she called the eyesore of the month. Yeah, it had accidentally uncovered a whole criminal enterprise. By dusk, the rumor mill had already broken the sound barrier. People started comparing Karen's stories. One woman mentioned how her $75 landscaping reimbursement check never arrived. Another confessed Karen refused to give her a copy of the annual budget. A man from 2 streets over said Karen had once told him the HOA had special legal access to walk his backyard trail. No one believed her at the time, but they hadn't thought much of it either. Now they realized they'd been living under the rule of someone who didn't just bend the rules. She buried the truth. The local paper ran the headline 2 days later. HOA president detained after dog uncovers illegal cash behind fence. Underneath was a side photo of Karen being led to the squad car, still clinging to her clipboard like it was a life raft. The article detailed her attempt to hide HOA records, embezzlement suspicions, and a pattern of false violations against residents. My name wasn't in the article, at my request, but word got around. People figured out I was the guy with the shed and the dog. For the first time since I'd bought the lake cabin, people I didn't even know started waving when they walked by. Some knocked on the door with baked goods. Others left handwritten thank you notes, one of which simply said, "You stood up when the rest of us were just fed up. Thank you." It felt strange, that shift in energy. Karen's arrest didn't just remove a bad apple. It cracked the entire basket. The HOA board was stunned. Their president, the one they'd trusted with budgeting, voting rules, and community enforcement, had been weaponizing her position for personal control. And it wasn't just about money. One board member, a quiet guy named Phil, called for an emergency internal audit. Turns out there were multiple inconsistencies in the HOA's operating budget. payments made to a consulting firm that didn't exist, duplicate entries in the landscaping schedule, even a missing laptop that was last logged in using Karen's credentials. But it got worse. Legal review of the HOA bylaws showed that Karen had slipped in quiet amendments over the last 2 years, rewordings that granted her sole discretion to authorize fines under aesthetic concerns and temporary behavioral disruptions. Basically, if she didn't like your Halloween decorations or your kids playing too loud, she had the authority to cite you. All that power and no checks. Until a shed went up and a dog started digging. The police investigation deepened. Karen was formally charged with tampering with HOA records, obstruction of justice, unlawful possession of community property, filing false complaints, and suspected misuse of funds exceeding $10,000. When those charges were announced, the HOA board scrambled to save face. They sent out a community-wide email. Effective immediately, the board has voted to suspend Karen Mitchell from all roles and responsibilities within the Homeowners Association. An interim committee has been formed to reevaluate all policies enacted over the last 3 years. We thank our residents for their patience and transparency during this transition. Translation: they've been blindsided, and they were praying for forgiveness. The very next weekend, the neighborhood held a public meeting at the local rec center. More people showed up than anyone expected. Some were angry, some were confused, but most were just relieved. I sat in the back, Rex on my feet, quiet. When the mic was opened to residents, a woman stood and asked the question on everyone's mind. How do we let it go this far? There was no easy answer. That's how Karen had kept control. Not with outright tyranny, but with passive aggression wrapped in formality. Citations delivered politely. Rules enforced unevenly. Neighbors isolated from each other by the fear of being the next target. That night, the community voted to form a resident oversight panel. They started reviewing every citation issued under Karen's leadership. Many were revoked. Finis refunded. Warnings shredded. They even changed the policy regarding external structures, like sheds. Turns out, Karen had tried to sneak in language barring standalone buildings near the lake, a clause that never passed a legitimate vote. My shed? Now the cover photo of the HOA's new transparency report. Irony, anyone? One of the most powerful moments came when an elderly man, white hair, cane in hand, slowly made his way to the mic. My wife and I were fined 3 times for overwatering our azaleas, he said, voice cracking with emotion. I stopped gardening because I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I missed that part of me. Thank you for giving it back. He didn't look at the board. He looked at me. And that's when I realized something. The shed wasn't the story. The dog wasn't the story. Truth was, Karen had weaponized rules to keep people quiet. I just happened to build something tall enough and solid enough that she couldn't knock down. And when Rex scratched at the dirt, it wasn't just her secrets he unearthed. It was the buried backbone of a community too polite to push back. Until now. It's funny how silence can feel completely different depending on who controls it. When Karen ran the HOA, the neighborhood's silence felt oppressive, like people were scared to speak too loud, park too crooked, or hang the wrong flag. But after everything came crashing down, that same silence felt peaceful, like everyone could finally breathe. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board by unanimous vote. The audit results were still rolling in, but the initial findings were damning enough. Several violations, 2 confirmed instances of fund misuse, and an open investigation into her tampering with HOA communications. The charges she faced weren't the kind you just shrug off. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Her mailbox was emptied, her porch lights off, and within a few days, the Karen 4 HOA signs were finally gone from the neighborhood. Good riddance. I spent the next few days finishing the shed, the very same one she tried to weaponize against me. I repainted the trim, sealed the windows, and added a final coat to the door. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, built legally, standing proudly, and now something a local landmark. Kids walking by with their parents would point at it. That's the one, right, Mom? Their parents would nod, half laughing, half still in disbelief. And Rex? Rex became a bit of a celebrity. I couldn't go for a walk without someone stopping to pet him. One kid even brought him a homemade bandana that said neighborhood security. He wore it like a badge of honor. Funny thing is, Rex didn't know he'd helped uncover a scandal. He just smelled something weird and did what dogs do, he dug. But that one paw swipe did more than reveal buried property. It unearthed everything Karen had tried to keep hidden. As weeks passed, the tone of the neighborhood changed. People waved more. Front yard conversations popped up where once there were cold stares. HOA meetings started including actual community input, not just declarations from a clipboard. The new interim board issued a letter thanking me for my patience and suggesting an amendment to clarify property rights once and for all. It wasn't flashy and it wasn't loud, but it was peace. One neighbor, the same one who used to cross the street to avoid Karen's glare, brought over a pie one evening and said, "You didn't just build a shed, you built a backbone for this place." I laughed. I just wanted to store my tools. "Well," she smiled, "I think you stored a little courage in there too." In the end, there was no parade, no big speech, no viral video, just a man, a shed, and a dog who liked to dig in the right places. And sometimes, that's all it takes to set things right. If someone calls the cops on you over a shed, don't shout. Don't throw things. Don't stoop to their level. Just build it right. Every board, every nail. And let it stand as a reminder that truth doesn't have to make noise to hold its ground. Because when someone like Karen comes charging in with rules she made up and authority she doesn't have, all it takes is one well-timed fact, and sometimes one curious canine, to flip the story in your favor. She thought she could twist perception, that she could weaponize her clipboard, her title, her fake outrage. But the moment my dog dug up what she'd been trying to keep buried, her entire narrative collapsed, and she had no one left to bark orders at. The shed still stands, same as the day I finished it. But now it means something more. Not just a place for tools, but a reminder that the law isn't about volume or intimidation or titles slapped on a newsletter. It's about knowing your rights and standing on solid ground. So the next time someone tries to rewrite your story, don't argue. Build. Document. Standtat. Because when your dog sniffs out the real lawbreaker, no HOA badge in the world can save them from the truth buried in their own backyard.